One of the most heinous things that have happened in South Carolina is the church shooting
Yeah.
that happened in 2015 by Dylan Roof. 8 people, I believe, got killed.
9.
9 people got killed, sorry. And one of them was actually a close friend of yours.
Yeah, Clemente Pinckney, man. Clem was dope. Clem had this really, really deep voice. And Clem was not only a United States, a South Carolina senator, but he was also on his way to be a bishop in the church. You know, Clem was just an amazing man. He always pushed for Medicaid expansion. He would always give you some words of wisdom. And let me tell you about that night, man. I was actually 2 blocks away when the shooting happened. I was having a fundraiser. I was a host for a fundraiser for Hillary Clinton right around the corner on East Bay Street in Charleston. And after the fundraiser's over, we all have to sit still because when you have a Secret Service protectee like the one that was there, like Secretary Clinton, they have to be able to leave the premises before anybody else can. And so we're just waiting for her to leave the premises. And I look at my friend Steve Benjamin, who's the mayor of Columbia, South Carolina, and he has a police escort with him. And I'm like, can we follow you? And they say, sure. And so I remember we pull out, we're going up I-26, and I've never seen so much law enforcement in my life. Just big sled trucks, big army tanker, everything, just zooming by. It's multi-jurisdiction law enforcement. And I call, and they're like, there was a shooting at the church. No one knew what happened. And then as I go a little bit further up the highway, I go to the 24-hour news source, which is Twitter, right? And they say 9 dead in Charleston Church. And my heart broke. And then I got a phone call. And not many people know this, Vlad, so I'll share with you, but I got a phone call that Clem had made it to the hospital. He got shot in the neck. And he's one of the only people who didn't necessarily die in the church, but he died there at the hospital. And I remember that so well because Clem let a straggly white boy with a backpack into his church for Bible study. He let somebody in that normally nobody would let in, right? And then he prayed with him. And he didn't sit him on the other side of the church. Clem set him right by him while the 12, 15 of them were having Bible study. And the cowardice of the moment is Dylan Roof didn't come in busting. Like, he didn't come in just letting off shots. Dylan came in, sat beside Clem, and they prayed and had an entire hour of Bible study. And then in their closing prayer, while Clem had his head down and while he was praying, it was very cowardice. While people were praying with their eyes closed and head down, Dylan Roof opened fire in the basement of a church. There's a special place in hell for people like that. And I know that a lot of people have forgiven Dylan Roof. I'm just not there yet because he took a friend and, we're close to Father's Day. And when you think about all of this pain and trauma, when you think about, I'm sure you've seen the images of George Floyd's daughter, on Stephen Jackson's neck saying that, Daddy changed the world. I think about Clem's 2 girls and them not being able to fix their Father's Day breakfast. And, those range of emotions all because of the color of their skin. And so, it's a difficult story, but it's one who, it's not an aberration. It's not a flaw of the system. It is the system.
Well, Dylan Roof avoided the death penalty and got 9 consecutive life sentences. Me personally, I feel like Dylan Roof needs the death penalty. Do you feel the same way?
So you asked me one of the most difficult political, you channeling your inner Don Lemon and Chris Cuomo here. That was, this is hard hitting. That was one of the most difficult political questions that I've dealt with. Because if anyone is to get the death penalty, it should be Dylan Roof. However, the death penalty is so disproportionately handed out to poor people and people of color that I can't advocate for it. Because there's so many people, as we know, who get cleared because of DNA evidence now. And so as much as I want Dylan Roof to, receive that punishment, I just can't say I believe in it. I think that his justice will come.
Well, you fast forward to 2020 and you just had a horrific set of events. Most recently, George Floyd. You were on CNN and you were actually crying about the situation, thinking about your own children, thinking about your relatives. And this really kind of follows your father being shot by the police. 50 years ago or so?
52 years ago, yeah.
52 years ago. When you heard about George Floyd, what was your first reaction?
Outrage. We go through these stages. That for me, it was a great deal of outrage and anger, and then sadness. I mean, you go through the stages of grief. But at the end of the day, you know what I noticed though is the same thing that happens in all those cases, and we now know that in the Ahmaud Arbery case, when he was shot, they stood over him and said, "All right, we know that." I mean, what went through my head was that they didn't give George Floyd the benefit of his humanity. I mean, I don't know anybody personally who can put their knee on someone else's neck for 8 minutes, 9 minutes, not even a dog. Like, they didn't look at George Floyd as being human. I mean, that's the fact of the matter. And people are talking about how this country is awakening. They're awakening because of minute 2, minute 3, minute 4, minute 5, minute 6, minute 7, minute 8, because no one can fathom. And when we try to tell you that's what the system has been doing to Black folk and people of color for so long, now maybe they can believe it because they've seen an officer with their own eyes do something that they wouldn't even do to dogs. And then if you did it to a dog, you probably would have been arrested sooner. And so I went from sadness to anger. I'm now in a stage of grief and kind of asking, where do we go from here? Because this is such a vicious cycle that I don't want it to continue, but in our country, it always does.
Right. On CNN, you said it's hard to be Black in this country when your life isn't valued.
I mean, we're arguing. If I say Black Lives Matter, you know the visceral pushback you get. And I'm not trying to say that Black lives matter more than yours. I'm not trying to say police lives don't matter. I'm not trying to say white lives don't matter. But we're not having a question in this country about the value of police lives. We're not having a question in this country about the value of Black lives. Of white lives, excuse me. But we are having a question in this country about the value of Black lives. And I think that, raising children is my difficult thing. Raising 3 Black children in this world. And there are people out there who won't give them the benefit of their humanity, who don't have any level of empathy. That is what scares me. And so I teach them to be unapologetically Black. I teach them to be prideful. I also teach them how to navigate and deal with law enforcement and deal with the Amy Coopers of the world. But that is the plight. That's the struggle of being Black in America.
Right. And on CNN, when you spoke right after George Floyd's murder, you actually cried on the air.
I did. I spoke not only after his murder, but after his brother. And, the question, I mean, it's a burning question for me. Like, how do you raise your kids in this environment? What do you tell your children? Like, as a Black man raising 3 children, one is 15 years old. I mean, I'm about to start a GoFundMe for her car insurance, because that's a whole different animal, putting them teenagers on your car insurance. But like, what do you tell children when you can be looking at birds in the park, or barbecuing, or relaxing, or on the beach, or looking at all of these things, and the police can be called on you. And this isn't new. I mean, when I saw Amy Cooper use her privilege against the birder in New York, I immediately thought about Carolyn Bryant. People are gonna be like, who's Carolyn Bryant? Carolyn Bryant's the white woman who said that Emmett Till whistled at her. And then up near her death, she was trying to get into heaven. And she told the truth and said she lied. But a man was a 13-year-old boy was brutally beaten. All the bones in his body, in his face, destroyed. He was thrown in the bottom of the Mississippi River because a white woman used her privilege and lied. And so that's the fear. That was the emotion. That was the raw emotion that I had. George Floyd needs to be alive today. And his crime was allegedly passing off a fake $20 bill. And the store owner said that he probably didn't even know that the $20 bill was not real. You think about George Floyd. That's George Floyd. Tamir Rice playing with a toy gun. Alton Sterling selling bootleg CDs. Eric Gardner was loose cigarettes. Walter Scott got pulled over for a broken taillight and owed child support. You think about all of these things and ask yourself, what was the death penalty crime in any of this? And the answer is it wasn't. But they just didn't get the benefit of their humanity.
I mean, has any police officer ever gotten the death penalty for something they did while in uniform?
Now, that is a really good question. I would venture to say no. You know, my father's case was the first time ever that police officers had faced charges for firing into, unarmed young people. Of course, they were all found not guilty, but that's perpetual. And I'm not saying things like defund the police. I don't think that's practical. But what I am saying is we need systemic changes. Like, why don't we have a nationalized database where we have to register cop complaints? So if you get fired for being a bad cop in one city, you can't go 2 cities down and get rehired and be the chief. Why don't we have a nationalized use of force and standardized training? So in one city, they're not teaching a chokehold, and in another city it's banned, but let's standardize that. Let's talk about qualified immunity so they can't hide behind shields when you sue them. And let's lower the standard so we can bring federal criminal charges against them. I mean, let's actually talk about how we change the system.
Well, then there's a Ahmaud Arbery case, which took over a month to even get into the public eye because the prosecutors didn't even want to take it on, felt it was somehow a justified killing. Just recently, they had released footage of the trial. It's, some of the pretrial hearings. And I guess Travis McMichael, who did the shooting, stood over Ahmaud's dead body and called him a effing N-word, basically.
I mean, this is the country we live in. And not only that, but he used to be a former investigator, right? Like, so think about the fact that he is a part of that system there. And Ahmaud Arbery he did something. He walked in an empty, you know how many times my wife and I have walked through an empty house that's being built? I mean, and he lost his life because of it. And so that's where we are. And I want everybody to understand this, Vlad. There was not justice because there was a video. Hell, the law enforcement and solicitors, they had the video and 2 people declined to charge them. The reason that there was outrage wasn't because there was a video, but it was because we saw the video. The public saw if that video was never released, you think those boys would have been arrested? Never. And so justice delayed is justice denied, in my opinion.
Well, recently, Bob Johnson, who was the original founder of BET, ended up selling the company to Viacom years ago, becoming, I believe, a billionaire or close to it. He called for $14 trillion in reparations for the descendants of slaves in the U.S. Do you agree with that?
I don't know where he got that number from, but it sounds good. I mean, I think one of the things that we have to do, though, even more importantly, is we have to have specific policy proposals to deal with the systemic, and it's a specific race policy proposals that deal with the specific race issues we have in this country. One of the things that Democrats and Republicans both try to do is tell you that a rising tide lifts all boats. Well, that's not the case. And so we have to make sure that we are doing everything necessary. And I don't know where he got $14 trillion from. But I do think investing in things like infrastructure, putting people back to work, a GI Bill for Black folk, investing in HBCUs, making sure we have rural hospitals in our communities, making sure we don't live in food deserts, making sure that we have small business loans given to Black folk, especially Black women who are starting small businesses at higher rates. All of these things are necessary to do. And if it's $14 trillion, Bob knows math better than I do. I'll believe him on that.
Yeah. I remember months ago, I made a statement about reparations on Twitter, which started to go viral and kind of take on a life of its own. And I said that I fully support reparations for African Americans, possibly in the form of a free college education. And all hell broke loose. Everyone started criticizing me, saying that a college education is not going to fix the problem and so forth. Me personally, I went to UC Berkeley. I have a computer science degree. I have made millions of dollars because of my college education. That was my perspective of it. But my perspective also was I felt that the U.S. wouldn't be able to come up with the type of money to properly come up with these reparations. But then after the whole COVID-19 thing, when suddenly trillions of dollars became available, I realized that I was wrong. So I had to go back and say, you know something, I apologize. I was actually wrong. The U.S. obviously has the money. They just don't want to spend it on Black people.
That's
What's
a
your
good
take on that?
That's a good analysis, and that's good introspection. I think that a GI Bill for Black folk is a part of it. I think that I think that people should be able to go to schools in this country for free, unquestionably. So that's the first part of it. But you're right. It's not as if we don't have the money. What we forget, though, is that every other group of immigrants in this country, while Black folk were going through Jim Crow and lynching and the et cetera, they were getting land. Out west, they were getting plots of land given to them and their families so that they could help build wealth, while Black folk were still dealing with discrimination that has been systemic and institutionalized. And so we have a lot of catching up to do. It's going to take, I think the studies say, and I write about it, it says it's going to take 228 years. It would take 228 years for Black folk in terms of wealth to catch up with their white counterparts. That's a long time. And so, yeah, I don't know what that number is, but we have to direct that money straight into race-specific programs in pockets of Black people.
Well, yesterday we made a statement about the killing of George Floyd, the company Vlad TV, and we also donated $10,000 to the NAACP. And the one thing that happened afterwards was that a lot of people started to criticize, not only the comments, but friends of mine, like prominent rappers and so forth who I talked to, were saying that I shouldn't have donated to the NAACP because they feel that they don't actually help Black people like other organizations. From your perspective, why do you think that there's that type of dialogue about the NAACP?
Well, first of all, thank you for your donation. And the NAACP needs money. And I'm just glad you had the wherewithal to do it. I mean, there are some organizations which are on the forefront, which are on the ground doing more work than the NAACP. I think that's an accurate statement to make. One of the things, not just about our civil rights organization, save for the UNCF and save for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, which is different from the NAACP, is that they become outdated, including our church. They become outdated. They're not progressive. They're not at the forefront of the change we see or we need. And we need our institutions to grow. We need our institutions to become younger. And the reason that people got mad at you, I don't think it was for the gift per se, but I think it was because they were utilizing you to display their frustration with an entity that we grew up with, but ain't never there for us on the ground. Like, I don't know the last time, have you seen the NAACP on the ground in Minnesota? Have you heard from them? I mean, that is the question. And I love Derek Williams over there at the NAACP. So my point to you would be that I'm challenging them to be better. And in fact, very rarely do I ever say this, but I'm challenging them to go back to be what they used to be. And they're not that anymore. And so there are better organizations to give. I know I got a lot of white folk asking me who to give to. I always say the UNCF. I always say the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. I always say the Bell Project, Black Lives Matter, particular organizations in your states. And so, yeah, and I understand the frustration because these organizations have to do a better job.
Well, we actually looked up the GoFundMe page for George Floyd's family, and it was currently, right now it's at $12.6 million. So we felt like, our money wouldn't really impact George Floyd's family. They already have at this point what looks like multi-generational wealth because of this. And, the silver lining in this is that the George Floyd died horribly, but in the process, he, like his daughter said, my daddy changed the world.
Yeah.
He created civil protest that has been bigger than any in the history of America. In all 50 states,
Yeah.
there are protests, as well as internationally in Paris and London and all these different places. And, and he provided literally multi-generational wealth for his family, for his daughter, and I believe he has a son and brother and so forth. So as tragic as his loss was, it did make a tremendous amount of change.
Yeah, but my only point to you, Vlad, would be like how many caskets do we have to walk behind to create generational wealth for our people? And how many caskets do we have to walk behind to awake the consciousness of a nation? And how many caskets do we have to walk behind before we actually get the systemic justice that we need? And so I am, and all of that at the end of the day, I mean, on Father's Day, just imagine how tough it's going to be for that little girl. And I guarantee,
Yeah.
I guarantee you she'll want them back.
Your father who, sorry?
No, I was saying, I guarantee you she would want her father back in exchange for all of those things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, your father, who was friends with Martin Luther King, recently this quote is starting to come back up again, where MLK wrote that at one point that he felt that the greatest danger to America was not the Ku Klux Klan or the racists and so forth, but the moderate white people, the ones who want to keep things as is, as opposed to what's right.
And at this moment right now, we're pushing those moderate white people. And I think that King was saying that we know the racist position, but it's those people who smile in our face. I mean, King also said that it's not the words of our enemies, but it's the silence of our friends that will be remembered during this time. And we're here again. I'm about sick and tired of white folk quoting King at me on TV and in my Twitter comments and things like that, because they usually utilize it to push back against the protest and the movement. When King was a revolutionary, he was a rebel. And we have to remember that. And so, I am pleased to see that now we have a collection of souls, of like-minded souls and good-hearted folk who are out here on the forefront trying to make change. I question how long that's going to last, and I hope it doesn't take another death to get there.
When you look at the protests, how do you feel?
Tired. Like, I'm just tired of this shit. Like, we always have to do this. Like, why? Like, I'm exhausted, literally, because you have to channel the emotions of so many people. Today, we're talking about today. I'm on TV because it's George Floyd's funeral, and just the range of emotions going through one's head and heart. Juxtaposing, trying to explain to the world what George Floyd's life meant and why it was cut short. It meant so much as a father, as someone who was a friend, who lit up so many lives. It means so much in death. But he was killed because he was Black, because I'm guaranteed you wasn't no white boy getting killed that same way.
You see the protests that are happening and thousands of people are gathered in these things. And this is really just happening the worst possible time with the pandemic. Just the worst possible time.
Yes.
And I look at these huge gatherings and I'm just like, I understand why people are doing it, but my God, like in an era of social distancing and a deadly virus with no cure and no vaccine, it's just such the effects of it are going to be so bad. And the Black community was hit especially hard by coronavirus. I remember you had made some comments about the Surgeon General, how,
Yes.
What were the phrases that he used?
I do it for Papa and mi abuela, etc. Look, there are two viruses that are killing Black folk in this country. One is coronavirus and the other is racism, and they're both rooted in the same thing, right? And what I mean by that is that when you look at coronavirus, and the reason that Black folk are dying at disproportionate rates is because of systemic injustice. It's not as if we're just predisposed to die sooner, but it's the fact that we live in communities that don't have clean water. We're inhaling dirty air. We're going to schools that are falling apart. We don't have access to quality care. We live in food deserts. And when you overlay a pandemic, it's apparent why you're more likely to die at higher rates than your colleagues and white folk. And then you think about just the inherent racism in that. And my point to Jerome Adams was, you're the only Black person in the room. You have to speak up and speak out about these disparities. You just can't not utilize the fact that you're at the table. He stood from behind the seal of the President of the United States from the White House podium and did not talk about the systemic injustices that Black people face. And you combine that with the fact that we're dying in the streets, from Ahmaud Arbery to Breonna Taylor to George Floyd to David McAtee. I mean, you think about all of that at one time, and Mayor Keisha Bottoms had it right. I mean, all those people protesting probably need to get a COVID test this week, because it's going to come back and it's going to be really bad. And it's going to spark up again. And again, Black folk are going to be on the forefront of the death and the ravaging that happens in this country.
Right. And then you have Donald Trump, who actually blocked you on Twitter at one point.
And then he first of all, Donald Trump, he talked shit about me, and then he blocked me. So I want you to know how cowardly that is, because I couldn't even respond.
Well, it seems that all of his speeches, none of them are focusing on the underlying problem of what happened to George Floyd. They're all focused on, how do we beat down these protesters? How do we get rid of these scum and like the words that he's using, these thugs and so forth, while now building a wall around the White House, and not actually addressing the underlying problem of why this is happening.
He's not capable, though. Like, I don't have any expectation for Donald Trump. My biggest problem are the people around him who refuse to say anything. Those people who we deem to be good, who don't say anything, or the white evangelicals who think this is okay. Like, Donald Trump doesn't possess the necessary compassion. He doesn't possess the necessary empathy. He doesn't possess the necessary humanity. And because he doesn't, this moment is too big for him. This country needs a leader with empathy. And Donald Trump, I mean, you're not going to change a 70-year-old man. You can't change them when they get there. And so this job is too big for him, and he's swimming in it. And that's the biggest problem that he has. This moment, he has no idea what to do.
Right. And then you have the situation like with Drew Brees recently, who, when asked about the kneeling and so forth, the police brutality, he said, "I'll never do anything to disrespect the flag," which he ended up apologizing for the next day. But it just shows the divide of what's happening.
He didn't apologize for it. That was the weird part about the apology. He apologized for the way that we interpreted what he said. He said, "I'm sorry you took it that way." He didn't apologize. I mean, like, anybody who still thinks that the protests are disrespecting the flag are simply not paying attention. In fact, I think Colin Kaepernick will be looked at as a hero, because I think the perception of him is going to change 180 degrees by the overarching majority of Americans who didn't care for him. But Drew Brees is just, I mean, it's just an example of the privilege that we're talking about. And Drew Brees is a good dude for all that he does in New Orleans, all the relief that he's done after hurricanes, etc. He was the Walter Payton Man of the Year. But he still has a blind spot the size of the Grand Canyon. And that's what we're talking about. That's why these conversations are so important, because even good people have blind spots. And I still think Drew's a good person. I just think he has a racial blind spot, and sometimes he needs to shut up.
Right. And then I believe Laura Ingraham, started criticizing the people that were basically upset at his comments, like LeBron James and KD and so forth. And she literally said, "You guys should just shut up and dribble." Whereas Drew Brees has a right to his opinion.
The funny part, I can't put my finger on the difference between Drew Brees and LeBron James in her eyes. I just wish I knew what it was. You can imagine Laura Ingraham being that racist, having that position where millions of people listen to her. I mean, it's just it's pervasive everywhere, even in our media.
Well, Bakari Sellers, I appreciate you sharing your thoughts. A very difficult time. George Floyd's funeral is later on today. I know you have to, contribute to that. Very sad time, but at least, changes seem to be starting in the majority of America. It seems like the people that want things to stay the same, those people are starting to dwindle.
Well, let me just say this, Vlad. I'm thankful that you gave me this platform. I hope people go out and get My Vanishing Country. But even more importantly, I mean, you sparking this discussion, inviting me on to have this discussion with your wide, vast platform, and meeting people where they are and having this discussion where sometimes people don't have these talks and these conversations. And so I'm grateful for you, and I'm grateful for you using your voice in such a powerful way. So peace.
Absolutely. Until next time, all the best.
Thank you, brother.